Okay, you are an IB student studying history and the Cold War as part of your history course, and you can find the syllabus in the IB History Guide. And today I'm going to talk about institutions, alliances, organizations, and diplomacy in the Cold War, focusing from 1945 to 1961, and this is in response to several points on your syllabus, including alliances and diplomacy in the Cold War, the role of the United Nations and the non-aligned movement, U.S. policies and developments in Europe, including the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and NATO, Soviet policies and the Sovietization of Eastern and Central Europe, including Comecon and the Warsaw Pact. So let's begin with the United Nations. The idea of bringing together a body of nations to assure European peace is an old one that dates back to the 18th century, but we should think of it as beginning after World War I with the Paris Peace Conference and the Treaty of Versailles and the formation of the League of Nations, which was an earlier attempt to form such a body, and of course the League of Nations failed. And the League of Nations failed for many reasons, including the deliberate exclusion of the Soviet Union and the refusal to participate by the United States, but especially by the inability or unwillingness of its member nations to enforce the rules when first Imperial Japan and then Fascist Italy and then Nazi Germany started misbehaving. So FDR and the others who were involved in forming the ideas of the United Nations were very well aware of this, and they wanted to give this new body some powers to make decisions. And this becomes one of the first points that we have to discuss in terms of the United Nations. It had to be something that had some power. And Stalin was one of the first ones to point that out. As a matter of fact, there's a very famous exchange between Churchill and Stalin that happened at Yalta. I recommend that you look it up because it's quite amusing. And Churchill was talking about how it was important to give these new nations a voice. They needed to be able to express themselves and to have a voice. Well, of course, Stalin immediately honed in on that and said, well, they need to have more than a voice. They need to have the right to take action and to have a decision being made. For example, said Stalin, suppose China has a voice. If China has a voice, they're going to say, you should return Hong Kong. But China wants more than a voice. They want action. They want a decision to be made. And then he goes on to say, for example, if Egypt has a voice, they will say, you should return the Suez. But they want more than a voice. They want a decision to be made. So that exchange was very amusing, as I said, and Churchill was also pointing out how in order to have world peace, we have to make sure that no nation can dominate the world. Now, of course, knowing Churchill and his anti-communist ideas, you can understand exactly what Churchill meant. He didn't want the Soviet Union to be able to dominate the world. So again, of course, Stalin, who picked up on Churchill's insinuation, immediately pointed out, now, which nation might want to dominate the world? Now, of course, Stalin knew quite well that for the past 100 years, the British had been very proud of the fact that the sun never sets on the British Empire, and that the British had been either dominating or attempting to dominate the world for the past 100 years. So Stalin demanded of Churchill, which nation might want to dominate the world? Surely you're not suggesting that the British would want to dominate the world. And Churchill wanted to respond, but Stalin said, no, let me finish. Surely you're not suggesting that the United States might want to dominate the world. So which country is it that you are expecting might want to dominate the world? And Churchill very cleverly said, Marshall, the way the big three are now, we know that none of us would even dream of trying to dominate the world. But, Marshall, we won't live forever, and 10 years from now, we might be gone, and who knows which future country might try to dominate the world. So we have to put into place an institution which can guarantee that no country will dominate the world. So from the beginning, you see there's a bit of tension between Churchill and Stalin, and between Stalin and the Western world, because Stalin is anxious that this new body, the United Nations, might be used by the United States and the UK, in other words, by the big capitalist powers, to set up some sort of organization whereby the capitalist countries dominate the world. And if you look at the original list of nations, which I suggest that you do, in the United Nations, which went from like 26 nations to 51 during the course of World War II. By March 1945, I think there are 51 nations that have signed up for the United Nations. The list is very long in Central America and Latin America, and virtually all of those countries are allied with the United States and will vote with the United States. The list is also long in Western Europe. So Stalin is immediately suspicious that this institution is going to be used to set up some sort of Anglo-American capitalist domination of the world. And so he says, and the Russians say in the voice of Molotov, the USSR, the Soviet Union, is 15 republics united. We're 15 different republics, so we need 15 seats on the United Nations. But the U.S. and the U.K. refuse to have that. They point out that many of these republics do not even have any embassies anywhere. They don't have a foreign ministry. They don't have any department to deal with diplomacy or international affairs. So they can't really be considered independent nations. They are actually dependent on Moscow. So the compromise in the end is that the Belarusian SSR and the Ukrainian SSR, who do have some of those ministries, will be admitted as separate nations. So Stalin and the Soviet Union get three voting memberships within the Soviet Union. But of course, Stalin is well aware that the countries of Eastern and Central Europe, where the Red Army is situated in 1945, namely parts of Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, are all going to have governments that are friendly to the Soviet Union, which Stalin and the Russians feel is absolutely their right after their sacrifices they had put into World War II, and after, in their view, liberating these countries from Nazi Germany. So the tension is there from the beginning at the United Nations, and of course the big issue is the veto powers and the permanent memberships on the Security Council, which is the executive decision-making body within the United Nations. So there are 5 permanent seats, of course, and these belong to the Soviet Union, the United States, Britain, France, and China, which at 1945, at the beginning of the United Nations, is the Republic of China under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalist Party. And what happens in 1949, in October of 1949, is that Chiang Kai-shek loses the Civil War. Mao Zedong declares the founding of the People's Republic of China, and naturally the Soviets presume that the permanent seat on the Security Council will be transferred from the Republic of China to the People's Republic of China, and then there will be 3 capitalist nations and 2 communist nations on the as permanent members of the Security Council. And what happens is the U.S. absolutely refuses, and they insist that the Kuomintang, the KMT or GMD, depending on which acronym you use, is the rightful representative of the Chinese nation, even though they are now isolated on the island of Taiwan, and they insist on China maintaining the veto power and the permanent seat on the Security Council. Well, the Soviets don't like this at all, and they walk out and they boycott, which they do periodically in the first 15 years of the Cold War. And you see that immediately this works to Truman's advantage, because when Kim Il-sung and North Korea invade South Korea on June 25th of 1950, Truman turns to the United Nations and gets a coalition of 15 countries that will fight under the UN banner, under the United Nations flag, in the Korean War. So the tension from the beginning is the United Nations an organization that truly serves all the nations of the world, or is it an organization that props up the Western powers' domination of the world? Now, of course, most of the nations in the United Nations would say, no, we're not here to prop up the Western domination of the world. We're here to express our rightful voice as an independent nation. And this is particularly true of the newly independent nations as they start to win their independence in the post-war era, particularly true of the newly independent nations of Asia and Africa, who begin to look for a third way, a middle road between communism and capitalism, and who quite explicitly express a desire to stay out of the Cold War and not to get involved in this struggle between the Soviet Union and the United States.